totally fine. Great. Um, I think if it stays at a relatively small group, I don't mind if you just unmute yourself and just jump in if you have any questions. Um, but yeah, thank you, Sophie, for organizing this and making meetings possible virtually. And yeah, so originally the in-person symposium, I was asked to talk, have a bit of more of a talk about like my personal journey and things like that. But I think it's kind of boring. So, and I thought that it might be actually good to have more of an open like Q&A, because if you're already into modular, you probably look up a lot of discussion threads and tutorial videos, and there's usually just a lot of questions that keep popping up, or there's more specific questions if you're already um, have a modular system and there's specific questions. So I thought that today I can address some of the more common questions to start, and then open up the floor for to carry on the conversation if there's something that I haven't addressed. Um, so yeah, and yeah, feel free to, I've got my chat window open, so feel free to type in a question or a comment at any time, um, and then I'll try to address it. But so I can't, first of all, I can't say I know everything about modular, and I don't think it's possible to know everything about modular, um, either in terms of the possible techniques you can do, or the kinds of modules that are out there, the different formats of modular systems. So I don't claim to be, you know, crazy expert on on anything other than what I've, in the 5 years that I've been working on the modular. Um, and I'll get to the philosophy of my build. Thanks, Ananda, for your question. Yeah, and like people's philosophy, people's vision for what they want their modular synth to do. So those are all the things that we can kind of talk about. But but I want to start by saying that I used to work at Moog Audio in Toronto as a modular specialist, and when people come in and look at this big modular wall that's in our store, you know, usually they either like if they're like a tourist, they either start taking a selfie or like taking a video in front of it because it just visually so um, impressive, and it doesn't actually look like a musical instrument per se. A lot of people are like, that looks like a space station, or that looks like control deck for something, or an operator wall, and then usually it'll be like, do you know how all this works? Or how do you understand all of this? It's can you show me something simple? Those are would be like kind of the common reactions I'd get, or common questions I get at the store. And my response to that um, is usually, I want to make it accessible and kind of demystify what they're seeing. So usually I would ask them if they've worked on if they've worked in a DAW before, if they worked on a computer, if they've have used any soft synths on in Ableton or GarageBand or Reason, because the modular system is basically kind of a parsing out of the same components that you see in a soft synth, right? Terms like oscillator and filter and sequencer, which if you've worked in GarageBand or yeah, any of those digital audio workstations, computer programs, which is probably what most of us use nowadays for recording and writing songs. It's once you start looking at the components, they start to become more recognizable and become a little bit more accessible. The difference is that instead of having everything under, a panel of knobs that's already pre-designed, in with a keyboard synthesizer. The modular system is something you just have to put together yourself, and you have to make those connections yourself. And so, and the cool thing is, like, I remember there's customers that come in knowing absolutely nothing, and they'd ask me, they would come in like, a few times over the course of 2 or 3 weeks, trying to get themselves to start a modular system and asking me like really, really basic questions. And and at the end, they get a case, they start getting modules, and within 3 or 4 months, they'd be coming back and like knowing exactly what they want, you know, being able to talk about their modular system with so much more literacy and knowledge. And that's within like, a couple months or within 3 or 4 months, and knowing, feeling much more comfortable with talking about, modules and manufacturers, and because it's so accessible now with the internet, there's so much resources out there. Um, and so I guess the first question I want to address um, is actually, since we have a relatively small group, I just want to get a sense of who already, so who plays with synthesizers, like software, hardware, who have started. Okay. Um, Good. So everyone either has, are you guys mainly like software based, or do you have like analog vintage hardware stuff, or what do you guys do? You can take turns. Software? Yeah, you can type it into the group chat if you want, or you can unmute yourself, or Sophie can unmute you.
I have some experience years ago with mini Moogs and things of that sort. And I've just started building a modular system, but basically I'm brand new to that aspect of it.
How big
Um,
how big is your modular system right now? How many modules do you have?
in terms of modules, it's like one,
Okay.
um, but it's basically a flight case
Uh-huh.
for like a drone. So it has two racks in the bottom and two racks in the lid,
Cool.
and it'll be like 2 feet wide. So
Nice.
quite a lot of potential.
Yeah, so 2 rows, that's 4 rows
Yeah,
of space. That's yeah, that's huge.
yeah, yeah.
That's a lot of potential.
Um, I do have a question. You don't have to deal with it right away.
Sure, let's do it.
Um, about sort of the musical theory of ambient music, as it were.
Hmm.
Because when you think of classical music or pop
Mhm.
songs or
Mhm.
whatever, there's a theory in there. There's chords, there's patterns, and so on. And in modular, all you really have is like a 32 note repetition option with hundreds of variations.
Mhm.
So there has to be a bit more to it, I'm thinking.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really
Um,
good
and,
question. That's a really deep question as well. But
yeah.
we can start with that. I also want to acknowledge Ananda's question. What's the philosophy of the build of my build? And we can all share kind of um, our own philosophies as well. Um, yeah, Ted, did you want to add to your question?
Oh, I was just typing in the chat window. Yeah, so
Yeah.
basically my experiences with Native Instruments Reactor,
Yep.
going back to the early 2000s, and
Mhm.
playing around with the built-in virtual synths in Logic, just changing parameters and experimenting with the virtual modular synths in
Yeah.
the software universe, I guess.
Yeah, and Reactor is actually I did my undergrad in music at York, and I did a bunch of digital music courses, and one of them was called Sonic Architecture, and we used Reactor to learn about the architecture of like electronic music instruments. So it's basically a software modular environment. It's been out for a long time, but it's basically like it's like a modular thing, but it's more like a flow chart, right? So you'd create an oscillator and then you like draw a cable and connect it to an amplifier and then draw a cable and connect it to a sequencer, that kind of stuff. So Reactor's super powerful. So yeah, I mean, if you've already worked with Reactor, chances are you'll probably um, be able to navigate a modular system. Do you have any modules right now?
I don't have any hardware to speak of. I've got a lot of keyboard MIDI controllers,
Mm-hmm.
like the Novation products with
Mm-hmm.
all the knobs and faders and joysticks. And
Cool.
but the direction I've gone is basically, I guess, for financial reasons, to go with software. It seems a little bit more flexible.
Mm-hmm.
But for whatever reason, yeah, that's the direction I've gone. But I'm
Yeah.
super interested in hardware and everything that you're showing us today. So
Cool. And Ananda, you mentioned that you have built some kits. Did you? So yeah, tell us about the kits, and we can get into
Um,
that.
so I first got into modular because in Glasgow there's this group called Glasgow Make Some Noise, and they would like meet in a basement of a church every weekend. We'd all like crowd like source and pitch in to buy different modules. So I just have like a really like basic um, like random voltage generator, and then like a couple of really basic modules that
Mm-hmm.
I've collected that have just like taught me the basics of
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
modular synthesis. And like over the years they kind of have become more affordable as people keep like trying there. I feel like there's like a sub like or like a niche of people trying to make accessible
Mm-hmm.
um, kits, and like
Mm-hmm.
it's great to learn about soldering.
Yeah.
But there's a difference between like I tried doing surface mount
Mm-hmm.
and I gave up because it didn't work after a while, so I mainly just do through hole. But it's like really fun to get into if you want to like spend $50 or $70. It's like fun to learn.
Yeah, for sure. I just started doing surface mount, learning surface mount, and I did through hole. Is everybody familiar with soldering, or know what it is, or have done it before? Um, yeah, a friend of mine calls it welding, but it's kind of like welding, but with like tiny little wires. So yeah, so there are a lot of modules that come in kits, or just come in a circuit board. The thing, yeah, I'll actually mention it now. The thing with modular synths today, the great thing is that it offers like multiple access points. So it's not just musicians that uses or become interested in modular synths. You can enter it from a computer programming um, background. You can enter it from an electrical engineering background. You can enter it from a design background. You can enter it from like a harsh noise artist background or a classical background. And that's, I think, one of the appealing things about modular, and one of the things that make it, in a way, inclusive of people with different background. It's not just for musicians. Um, but yeah, so I started surface mount soldering only because I now work at a lab in Ryerson, and it has the right tools to allow me to do surface mount. And I find that the thing with surface mount is you do need to buy like the the proper tools to do it. Um, One is like a magnifying glass, or a thing that allows you to see the points more clearly, because some of the parts are really, really small. So that's one thing different from a through hole. Um, and also, like, I don't know a lot of electronics, so it's sometimes harder to troubleshoot if you like if you build something and it doesn't fully work and you don't know why it doesn't fully work. So yeah, so I know a lot of folks who have a engineering background and know electronics, and maybe have a workroom with tons of parts that they already have. They can just sort of start experimenting with things. And there's also a lot of resources like circuits, like people share their actual circuits, and if you can read schematics, then you can actually build things yourself. So so I think offering multiple access points is kind of a really cool thing, that you meet people from different backgrounds when you involve yourself in modular. Um, so Tom asked a question about music theory, which is a really great question. And yeah, so as you mentioned, Tom, if you're studying, some or most of us who has grown up learning an instrument, there are certain things that we were taught around the relationship between pitches, right, and harmony and chords and things like that. I've read a long time ago that, for example, a lot of people didn't appreciate the relative simplicity of, let's say, electronic music that's a lot of it's just repetitive drum patterns and a single bass line or a single synth line, because it's like, well, there's no melody and there's no harmony and there's no, there's no key modulation and things like that. But I think the point of electronic music is not to work with those types of things. I think using electronic music instruments is much more about exploring timbre, which is also something you talk about in like classical music, right? What's the tone, like the timbre of like different instruments and stuff. But I think what the modular synth allows you to do is to explore timbre and how you can make things change over time, harmonically or timbrally. Harmonically, as in like in relation to the timbre of a sound. So so while those who know so-called, like, I would say like Western art music theory, can still apply those things, can still apply their knowledge of pitch and composition and harmony to this instrument, for sure. You can also think about kind of layering that with especially with ambient music, right? It's all about slow changes, right? It's all about kind of slower, sustained sounds and how they change over time, and kind of the sonic and emotional effect that has on the listener. So I would say if you're asking about ambient theory, obviously, someone like Brian Eno has done a lot of writing and a lot of sharing of his knowledge and his process around his style of ambient music, right? And I think ambient music is also quite a wide label. There's ambient music that is more like drony and slow moving, and there's ambient music that's very rhythmically driven. So I don't know if that helps and offers some clarity to your question. Yeah? Cool. So Ananda has a question about how do you compose with modular? Is this a thing? Yeah, so composition, I think composition is another interesting sort of concept that we all have, like, kind of basic ideas of what a composition is, right? And again, we because we're so used to hearing and being exposed to composed pieces, as in like pop music or as in classical compositions, you might think that, oh, I need to write down and write stuff on a staff paper in order to compose something. But and all of you have already played with synthesizers, and I'm sure all of you have used different approaches to composition. And usually for me, I start off, I mean, there's so many ways to do it, right? Like sometimes I would have an idea of what kind of sound I want. And it's like, okay, I'm thinking of this drone and I'm going to try to make it. This morning, because I wanted to create a demo patch. And so I thought of like, oh, I want it to have this kind of like a melodic line. And so I have a sequencer here, which is like a touch sequencer. And so I can program the notes here. There's 2 rows of notes, and I can also split the sequencer into 2 separate 5-note patterns. So I don't know if you can see the light flashing. So I've got this pattern here that is kind of a bass line, and I'll turn it up. So I've got a couple of oscillators sort of kind of doing a hard sync and then running through a filter, right? Low pass filter. And then I'm triggering a very short envelope, right? And then putting the envelope into the control input of my VCA, voltage control amplifier, so that this very short shape is controlling the volume, right? And then the pitches I program on the sequencer is going into the oscillator pitch control. So I've got note changes that's controlling my oscillator. The output of my oscillator is going into my amplifier, and this envelope, this short little plucky thing, is controlling the volume, right? So if I turn down the volume control, the envelope's not doing anything. Or if I just turn up the I guess it's like the gain knob, it's just droning. And if I turn up the control again of the VCA, this envelope is giving me, oh, and I've got some reverb, so. And this is a little. So there's a little bass line, and I do find it, I was gonna talk about like what you can do with a modular that you can't do in a DAW, and what you can do in a DAW that you can't do with a modular. That's also one of the questions, like kind of the common questions is like, why do I need a modular system, or you know, what can't I do? And one of the things I find that is much harder on a modular system is polyphony, right? Having multiple voices, because each sound source is its own module, right? You have to have one oscillator to get one like sound source. And if you want to make a chord, you have to have another oscillator to play a different note, right? Does that make sense? So I find like polyphony, if you want to like play chords, I usually just like open up Ableton and find a soft synth and find, you know, find chords that way, you know, if I want to have like many layers of sounds. I do have like 3 oscillators in my little system, so it allows me to have maybe like up to like 3 separate lines going. so right now, right now I just have one thing going, right? I just have one bass line. And I decided that over this bass line, I kind of want this ambient kind of tone that's floating over it. So I added another oscillator. I'm just turning up the other oscillator. And I'm adding a couple of effects pedals. Delay. So I don't know if you'd consider that a composition, because it's just like a bar of thing that just repeats and doesn't change. So the idea of composition on a modular system, I find does take a little bit of planning. You know, if you were to either compose like a live set, for example, if you ever, you know, consider performing live, then you have to think about how over like 30 minutes or 40 minutes you're gonna make musical changes in your modular system, right? You can either have like sequencers where you can change the notes, or you can have, what I like having in a modular system is switches, things that either switch from one thing to another or turn things on and off. So switches are helpful. You know, if you have a couple of different sequencers and you have two sequences running, then you can actually send one or another to an oscillator at different times, right? So you can create variation that way. You can also, I love having like a lot of mixers and utilities in my system, right? Mixers, attenuators, attenuverters. Everybody familiar with what they mean? So attenuators, attenuverters, basically, if you work with analog synths, if you work on hardware synthesizers like a mini Moog or, you know, hardware synths, is basically your modulation depth, right? You can kind of control the depth of like an LFO, you know, going into a modulating a filter, for example, or going into the pitch of an oscillator. So attenuators are really, I find, really useful and important if you want to add more like subtle changes to things. Mixers are great because mixers are not just for audio, right? Outside of modular, mixers are always for like sound signals, right? In PA systems, or even in like in a DAW like Ableton or Cubase. But in a modular system, mixers could be used for control signals. So you can mix an envelope with an LFO and a sequencer, and then send the mixture of all those signals to control something else, right? So really there's the modular synth, because of the nature of its openness, it allows you to do a lot of things a lot easier that you can't do in a DAW, right? Does that make sense? Anybody have questions around that idea of like starting to think about composition? And does that kind of answer your question, Ananda? Yeah. Okay. And we can keep sort of along those lines. Sophie has a question. How do you memorize as patches or write them down, or is everyone? In my experience, because I am, even though I'm quite familiar with what my system does, I still am not confident enough to go to a live show without and patch from zero. I've never done that before. What I've done is I've usually created a patch 1 to 2 weeks before a gig and basically practice it. And again, as I mentioned earlier, because if I were to do a 30 or 40-minute show, I kind of want to make sure I know where things are going musically. I don't trust myself to just to kind of be so freeform. So I would give myself so Sophie, I usually write down notes for performance. Um, in the sense, like I would say, like first 5 minutes, like turn these two knobs, right? Or these 5 minute, like first 5 minutes, like let this oscillator run for a bit, and then at at 5 minutes I'll like start looping something, or at 5 minutes I'll bring in this percussive pattern. So my notes would be basically little like instructions of when to do what on what module. I also don't really repatch things during a show, right? So I kind of stick with one setup, one kind of combination of connections, and then I make sure that I'm very familiar with how things are connected a couple of weeks before the gig. So that's how I've done it in the past. I don't know if Ananda, if you've played live before with a modular or
Oh, I've only just really had one really noisy performance. That's it.
Sophie, have you played modular live?
Yeah, I have, but for me, it's like I'll sometimes write notes, especially if I'm using things that are beyond just the modular. But for the
Mm-hmm.
most part, I kind of just like freestyle it
Mm-hmm.
the way that I have like a rough idea, and sometimes yes, I will make some notes, but for the most part, it comes out very improv, and that's kind of just how I've always enjoyed doing live shows, because then I end
Yeah.
up surprising myself too.
Yeah. I mean, I wish I maybe like next time I have an opportunity to play, I might feel braver and maybe do like half a patch and then like patch during the show. Um, but in any case, I kind of like to have a better sense of where I'd like to go during a 30, 40, like I don't know, even a 20-minute set. Cause yeah. So that's just my approach. Um,
I could say something that might be interesting on that
yeah,
subject.
totally.
So in Logic, what I like to do for live is I pre-program the automation. So I'll be playing and I'll have different things going on with parameter manipulation, but I'll pre-program that so I can just play the keys and the computer covers the automation side of it. So it's the way I've gotten around that problem.
So when you say pre-program the automation, so do you have the automation lanes like pre-drawn?
Yeah, I got them all out in different tracks.
Mm-hmm.
So cut off, resonance, and then I'll play through the track live at home before the show.
Mm-hmm.
I'll record the automation.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I go into the gig setting, I mean, yeah, that's what I've done where I've just hit play and then I'm playing along with the automation. So it's
Right.
a little bit of a one-man band. Like in the future, what I'd really love to do, and if there's anybody on the call who's interested in parameter control,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm a keyboardist, but I've always thought it'd be so cool to have like a controllerist and a parameter person who would like in real time play with the parameters in the modular synth while I'm playing the keys.
Yeah.
I think, yeah.
Yeah, and on that note, there are people are more and more coming out with like preset modules where you can save like voltages or settings for recall for a modular. So yeah, so exactly for the purpose that it's oh that's better. Sorry, my mic was like it's hard to yeah. So another thing that you can do better with like hardware synths with presets or in a DAW on a modular is it's you basically can't save your patches unless you take a photo of how the wires are connected. That's one way of saving patches, which I've used. I've tried writing out all the patch points, but if it's anything like larger than if Tom, you fill up your 4 rows of modules and you create this crazy patch. you know, it might, yeah, you can try to write down every connection, but if you want to exactly recreate the patch, you would also have to write down all the knob positions, right? So that's, it's the only way to save a patch. So in that sense, those who like to have the ability to recall, you know, settings on the modular, can look into like preset modules. It's basically like, I've seen modules with certain knobs or certain spaces, almost like a matrix, where if you can save a preset of knob settings, right? So those are voltage, and then you can just send that out. But then you also have to make sure the modules themselves are, the knob positions are the same as before, right? Because if you send, let's say you want to tune your oscillator for a song, right? And you have this knob setting set that to like a C or whatever of a note. The oscillator itself also has a pitch, has a frequency control, right? So right, this is pitch control of my oscillator, right? And what the preset module does, it basically sends a voltage on top of this setting. So if you change the setting, you know, another day and you want to recall, you have to make sure that this knob is also the same as, so the voltage that you send will create the same note. So I've already like changed the tuning of my I can't retuning, but that's okay. Yeah, and Tom, like or a lot of the appeal of the modular is that it changes over time. Are you talking about like the actual physical modules being reconfigured and swapping things out?
Exactly. You're always trading modules, building something new, so you don't have the same instrument you had last week.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I did a lot of swapping around in like the first 2 years when I first started. And I think a lot of people go through that. Partly it's like either they think they know what they want, and then when they get it, it's not what they want, or they hear people talk about something and it's like, oh man, this is like the best thing ever, and it's like it, and then you use it and it doesn't quite work out, not quite align with the music that you want to make, or whatever. It's like, or you get something and it's like, oh, actually I hate the interface, like I hate how it works. And so yeah, so which leads to Ananda's question, difficulties planning out a system. Can you tell us a little bit more about, yeah, like what kind of, are you, do you have difficulties choosing manufacturers? Do you have difficulties choosing, like, thinking of like a balance of functions? What's, if you can share?
Like sometimes I have a sound in mind, like I would really want to focus on like drums, and it'd be really nice to like have bass, but then there's only so much room that I have, that I want that, but I also want flexibility. But then I'm also just, I feel like I'm really indecisive most of the time, and it is really resource intensive. So I just wanted to know like what tips you have.
Yeah, I mean, if you clearly want to have drums and like bass, then I would focus on that, like focus on modules that do that. And again, I find flexibility, I find that having more utilities give you more flexibility, like having mixers or having like more VCAs gives you more flexibilities, because then it allows you more control. So if you say, I want to do drums and bass and also be able to do like ambient stuff, and you get just like drum modules and a bass module and like bunch of oscillators. I think that is more restrictive than if you were to. It also goes along with kind of the continuous learning process of how modular work, right? So if it's like, I know I can, you can get drum sounds by having a short envelope, right? You can use any oscillator, right, with a short envelope. So instead of getting a drum module, you get an oscillator and an envelope, right? Like maths and then so you can create drum sounds that way. Or if you don't want to create drum sounds, you can use the same oscillator and envelope and create more sustained sounds. So it's also, yeah, it also has to do with kind of continuously learning how modules work and how you can achieve the same thing with different tools, right? And yeah, like with, baseline, you can look at, there's modules that just emulate like a 303, right? With the same kind of filter and the same sort of square wave oscillator. But you can also find, a couple of other things that'll give you something that resembles it, that then you can use it for something else, if you get a little mixer. And does that make sense? Yeah, so understanding how to achieve things, and then like, but if you're like, everyone who works with who does drums on modular, gets like an Erica synth bass drum or like a noise engineering bassimilus, and it's like, if that's what you're gonna be doing a lot of times, and that's also a really great investment. It's like the bassimilus is amazing. It can do a lot of things. So yeah, it's kind of weighing, like you said, it's like, I want to do this, but then I also want it to be flexible enough. So you kind of weigh like what's more important, right? If you want something that is just like an amazing, 909 bass drum module, or you want something that can sometimes do a 909 but can also do a bass line if it needs to. Are there any other questions from anyone else? John or or a couple participants who haven't asked anything?
I have some questions.
Sure.
So this is kind of related. I follow, I think his name is Meng Chi, and I'm wondering if there are resources to learn more about like non-Western modular culture, or if you know of any. I know that there's like a noise scene in Southeast Asia, but then that's like the extent of like my knowledge.
Yeah, I've talked to Meng Chi before because I had a couple of his modules, and I just like messaged him on Instagram and asked him questions. He's a really nice guy. Yeah, Meng Chi is probably one of the bigger names in Asia, in China. I know there's a guy named Mudlogger, and he's an expat that lives in Thailand. And he does a lot of really cool things. He has some Eurorack, but he uses a lot of instruments from a guy named Peter Blasser, the company Siet Lombard, and who makes really weird, wacky, and beautiful instruments made of wood and banana jacks, and they're quite noisy and chaotic, but they're also really beautiful sounding. So Mudlog, I think his name is Jason Taylor. So Jason lives in Thailand. I've also briefly communicated with a guy in Korea named Dae Kim. He's a modular performer, kind of a sound artist. I think he does a lot of events in Korea. I see his activities on Facebook sometimes, and so there's quite um, a scene in, I think, South Korea. Um, I think there's even a couple of manufacturers in Thailand. There is, I think there's also an expat who lives in Taiwan that started making modules. I know there's like a modular synth shop that opened in Hong Kong a couple years ago that started selling modular stuff in Hong Kong. I used to live in Hong Kong, but at the time I wasn't into modular, and so I don't know anyone who uses it there. But I guess if they have a shop there, there must be, a bit of a demand there. People must be buying from them to. So that's my knowledge of the scene in Asia. I, I've, there are some books. I remember there's a book about the noise scene in Southeast Asia. I think there is a bit of a noise music scene there. Yeah. Is everyone in from Toronto or Canada, or is there is or where is everybody from?
Cambridge.
Oh, Cambridge. Okay. Ananda, where are you based?
Oh, Toronto.
Okay. Cool. Cool.
Heidi, I had a question. I was
Yeah.
just wondering, in terms of earlier you mentioned how you can send oscillator signals into a mixer, right? And then back into the modular to trigger sounds. Yeah. So I was wondering, could you use other signals to control the modular? Like I'm thinking, just different thing. I mean, just off the top of my head, like weather data or something like that, right? From the web, and then hook that somehow into
Yep.
the modular?
That's a really good question. Yes, you can basically send any kind of data, just like you can send any data into, Max MSP or any computer program. The thing is, you just need a converter, right, to convert whatever data into voltage, right, which is what the modular uses for all the inputs and outputs. So so even MIDI, you need a MIDI to CV converter for any kind of MIDI signal. You can't just there's no MIDI port. you need a converter. So if you want to use weather data, you probably have to do a couple of stages of conversion. You can either convert the data stream to MIDI nowadays. I don't know too much about MIDI 2, but like just the original MIDI, the resolution is really not that fine, right? And so a lot of people, if they're working with that kind of data, or especially continuous data, even from like sensors, right? Those are very fine resolution data. And so a lot of people use the OSC protocol, but then you have to convert that OSC to CV, to voltage, right? It always has to end up coming out of a jack that sends volts in order for it to control the modular. So there's all kinds of ways to integrate. You can also use acoustic instruments, right? You can use a guitar. I sometimes use a flute, but you still need. But then if you're using acoustic instruments, you need to convert that to some kind of voltage, whether you're converting the pitch of your instrument into voltage. That's a different thing from converting the volume of your instrument to voltage, right? So the pitch to voltage would require something called a pitch follower. So it follows your pitch of your instrument, like a flute or a guitar, and then converts that to like pitch voltage that you can control like an oscillator. So you can basically layer your guitar playing melodically and then control the oscillator pitch with that. Or I can convert the volume shape of my flute through what's called an envelope follower. So it detects the shape of the volume and converts that to voltage. And then to control it can control the volume or anything else, basically. So as long as you can convert it to voltage, you can control the modular.
That's cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Heidi. Yeah. That's great.
Cool.
There was an interesting presentation, I think, at Frequency Freaks some weeks ago. It was a fellow who's at York who is investigating presenting information using audio. And he had taken people's message histories, sort of anonymized it, and used that that data to influence the audio.
Yeah, that's super cool. Yeah.
So he was in an information presentation context rather than a musical one.
So did he convert the texting to, was it like audio information, or was it like kind of code, or like numbers interpreted in a certain way?
Well, it's like it was doing a 24-hour thing, so that messages from, say, parents, messages from friends, and messages from work. There were a few categories, and so that influenced how the sound was presented, or what sound was presented.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds really interesting.
It sounds a lot like Jack Jameson's work. He does similar things. He spoke at an earlier event of ours where they took mobile data and turned it into sound. Yeah.
Yeah. So at the lab that I'm currently working at Ryerson, I work in the responsive ecologies lab, the RELab at Ryerson, and we do a bunch of different things. But one of the things that my the lab director is specializes in early childhood studies, and so I was brought in to kind of explore how we can use, like, how young kids might respond to like a modular synth, because it's such a departure from kind of traditional Western art music based learning. It's so open-ended. It kind of affords a very non-linear way of exploring sounds and getting sounds happening. That's what we're working on. We're also it's going to relate to data. And part of that project is also using like Arduino sensor boards and stuff, and then making it into, like, let's say, like an object that you can throw. But then as you throw it, the rotation data or the acceleration data gets converted to, say, like MIDI, and like seeing how that, how we can map it to sound parameters that are audible to young kids, so they can make a relation between their action and how a sound changes. So you can definitely, and then if we wanted to control modular with it, we would just like have a MIDI to CV converter and then send that MIDI data out through a converter to control something on the modular. So that's all possible. You just need a bunch of conversions to make things communicate. Yeah. Are there any questions about specific, like, modules, how things work, or specific manufacturers, or yeah, like anything really? Like cases or power or standards of measurement, things like that.
Oh, I have a question. Where is a good place to get aluminum things for your racks?
Like rails?
Yeah, rails for your cases. If you like built your own case.
Moog Audio sells them. You can't get them in Toronto anymore because the store is closed, but they're available online. So just look up Tip Top Rails. Um, yeah, and then you can get they come in like 84 or 104 HP. Yeah, those are great for building your own case. Are you planning on building your own case?
I have one that I built, but the rails were provided to me, and so now I'm just like I want to add more modules, but I've been looking online and I'm like overwhelmed with all the different measurements, and I'm just like ah.
Mm-hmm. Do you all know what like HP is?
I'm so I've read about it and I'm
Mm-hmm.
still wrapping my head around it because I'm just like I I I know that like because I kind of was looking into the 2 HP modules and I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, this is great to save space. But then at the same time, I'm just like, I feel like it's something that like, how much should you care about HP? Because I'm not very picky. I feel like it's
Mm-hmm.
for people that are very OCD.
Yeah, I mean HP just measures the width of the module. I think it all depends on yeah, your personal preference on how much space you want, like between the knobs and cables. And sometimes you don't know until you start actually patching on things and where you place them in your case. So I sometimes I just swap things around because I realize like, oh, I thought this would be fine here, but then once I've got cables in it, I can't actually get to certain knobs on the module. So it's I have like big. I used to when I first started, I'd start it with one row. Like I got a 3U case, and then, like I was like, I'm not getting any more than that. So I end up getting like all these like tiny little like 4 HP modules. But then once I start patching, like they're so hard to get to. And then eventually I'm like, okay, you know, this is a rabbit hole I'm going to go down anyway. So I got a larger case, and I started getting bigger things like a maths, and you know, that math is 20 HP, right? So that's and it's fairly spacious. So I've yeah, so it depends on how much you want to invest, right? How much you want to invest, how much space you want to allow yourself to grow. And personally, I think I love this size. So this is kind of equivalent to like 2 rows of 84 HP, like a standard like 2 row case, rectangular case. This is 60 HP of 3 rows, so that's 180 HP, right? And I think 2 rows of a rectangular case is a perfect size whether you're just starting out. If you only have like 3 or 4 modules and you have all the space, it's plenty of space to grow. And I also think it's a really good size for even people who perform with it. Like it's enough space for a very flexible system, and it's not too big. Obviously, like if you have 4 rows like Tom does, that's even better. You know, to have 4 rows of modules, like that's all you need, really. Like for me, I can get most sounds I want out of a small system like this. But obviously, yeah, I know if I have the money and the space, sure, you know, I want a little bit more. Um, so yeah, yeah, the 2 HP stuff is great to fill in gaps and for like little utilities like mixers or little clock things and clocking things. So those are really great. I also really like the Erica Pico stuff as well. I find they're actually better quality than the 2 HP. Their designs are a little bit more interesting as well. So yeah, small modules are good. It's good to have a combination of both. Yeah.
Related question is how deep modules can be, because I'm investigating making some stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and it looks like yours would handle maybe a couple of inches, like 5 centimeters.
Let me measure it. Um, Yeah, so these are the Moog Mother 32 cases.
Mm,
So I got just a case and then put stuff in there, but they are kind of angled. So at
right.
different parts of the case is a little bit deeper. At the shallowest, I still have, yeah, like a couple of inches. Um, so I think more recent modules have become increasingly skiff friendly, right? People are more
Mm,
conscious of saving space and not
right.
having crazy deep modules. A lot of Doepfer modules have the perpendicular boards and can be really deep. Um, so if this is a panel, this is it's a circuit
Yeah.
board. A lot of, yeah, early Eurorack manufacturers who
Mm,
didn't really think about the vertical space. Like a suit and tie guy has like like modules that are like 10 inches deep, and you can't fit into any kind of
right.
recent case. But I personally really like Doepfer modules, so you know, if you're into those stuff, or yeah, if you make your own module, it's probably sometimes more convenient to position the PCB vertically, like Ananda was showing. And so you
Because
probably want to.
it does seem there's a trend for multi-layer, like your jack and control layer, and then your logic layer, and maybe another layer,
Hmm. Yeah, it
just to
depends
keep
on.
it narrow.
Yeah, it depends on how you design it. Um, yeah, it really depends on the kind of circuit you design. I was talking to my lab supervisor about, um, yeah, not making the circuit too crowded, you know, or having multiple. Even if you have couple of PCBs, that's still pretty. And if it's parallel to the panel, that's still not very high. It's still pretty
Right.
skiff friendly, right? It's still pretty. Um, you could probably fit into most cases.
Right.
Yeah. How deep is your case?
Maybe 3 inches,
Yeah, I mean,
maybe a bit more.
yeah, 3 inches. I know there's probably
W5.
dope for modules that are deeper than that,
Mm,
especially the DIY, like the DIY modules,
right.
um, tend to have deeper backs. So yeah, I mean, I if I had to like if I lost this thing and I had to do it over again, I'd probably get myself a fairly deep case just so I can like you know use I can put
Mm.
like older or DIY modules in there. Yeah.
But then you have to carry it around.
Yeah. Or I can just not do any gigs and just stay at home. Yeah.
Well, the future is all concerts from your home anyway.
That's right. Yeah. So it's probably gonna be virtual for a while anyway. So, um, yeah. And I mean, the other thing I've discovered for myself is like I don't like menu diving, right? Also, so another consideration for like when you're choosing your modules is like, do I do I want a lot of um, if I have a small amount of space, do I want to populate it with a bunch of functionally dense, like multifunction modules, right? To give me the most flexibility. But would I use them if I really hate like diving into menus? So I tend to not like screens and menus. I like to just like what you see is what you get. Because it's kind of, for me, the whole point of having this physical instrument is like a physical material relationship, right? Engagement. Like I can turn the knobs and know exactly what's happening. Um, Also, I hate memorizing like menus and what the orange light is and then what the green light means. So that's another consideration on like your direction of building your system. And you might and it might take a bit of trial and error, um, depending on the kind of module. Like for example, the clouds is probably one of the most popular modules out there, right? This granular delay thing, but the factory design is a little bit, it's not menu divey, but there's a few light combinations you have to remember to like access different modes, and it gets kind of complicated, and some people are just like, I love how it sounds, but I can never remember, and people print out I have a bunch of cheat sheets on the wall for certain modules because I can't remember all the functions, and I don't have I don't have that many menu divey modules, but there's a couple that I need to refer to a cheat sheet. So yeah, Tom, are you thinking of building some? Do you do programming, or are you more into like kind of analog circuitry?
I'm a retired programmer.
Cool.
But I'm
Okay.
looking at electronics,
Mhm.
analog electronics.
Yeah.
But one thing is that, for example, good filters, sharp filters are really hard to do in analog and relatively easy to do in digital signal processing. So that might be,
Filters?
yeah.
Mm.
So like bandpass filters.
Mhm.
One thing I'm curious about is a vocoder,
Mhm.
which is maybe not an early project.
Yeah.
Want to get some more experience before I get seriously into that,
Yeah.
but that needs a lot of sharp bandpass filters.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I know that anything that does like vocoding things in the modular are usually quite pricey because I think it's either
Mm,
very DSP heavy or gets it's pretty complex, I
yeah,
think. Yeah. Um, Also, I think with digital modules, um, you have to look more at the quality of the digital analog conversion,
right.
right? Because ultimately, any digital information again has to be converted back to voltage for input and output. So either like the analog to digital conversion, whatever's going in gets digitally processed, as well as whatever the calculations then comes back out as voltage. So I think, yeah, with digital modules, I sometimes a lot of the specs or what people look for is like the quality of the DACs, right? Whereas with analog modules, you're only working with
Right.
circuits and
And it
electronics.
certainly seems cheating to me to have what you're describing as an analog synthesizer with all these patch cables, when every time it goes into a module, it gets digitized, processed, and re-analog.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the function, right? Because if you want to, rebuild something like a mini Moog in modular and have more flexibility, you can totally create everything with analog modules, right? Because what you need is like oscillators and envelopes and a filter and some switches, right, to activate that. But if you want to build a system with like reverb and delay, most of the modules out there that does effects are probably going to be digital. I mean, there's like spring reverbs and like analog delays and stuff like that, but a lot of the effects processing are digital, especially if you want to get into like granular or like sampling. That has to be a digital module, or if you want a multifunction module. Yeah. So Ananda posted a yeah. That's hilarious. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't think too much about the whole like analog digital debate. Um, there's way too much out there, especially in the Eurorack format, that are that are both analog and digital are just as good. Especially oscillators. There's plenty of really great analog oscillators. There's plenty of really great digital oscillators. Yeah, I mean, if you want wavetable-y things, or mutable instruments is one of the most popular Eurorack manufacturers, and it's all digital. It's all code. It's all open source. So, I think it's an interesting debate, but I don't worry too much about it. I've heard that like analog modules are sometimes easier to fix and modify, because sometimes it just involves like replacing a resistor or replacing like a physical part. Digital modules, when something goes wrong, it could be the whole chip, or and you have to kind of look into the code and the firmware, and I think sometimes that gets a bit trickier to troubleshoot. And I've had to troubleshoot stuff at, when I worked at Moog Audio, and often with digital modules, it's like, yep, like, it's a bad chip, you have to send it back, or sometimes it's easy in the sense that, oh, just reinstall the firmware, and that would be the fix. So, so again, there's really no conclusion to what's better or what's easier. Are there any other questions? Any like comments, conclusions, or like personal experiences?
Just to thank you.
Oh, thanks for hanging. Thanks for all your questions. Those are all really, really good questions, and I hope I help answer some of them.
Hey guys, thanks all so much for joining in today. If you know anybody that wasn't able to join in, we do have the recording, which will be posted. So yeah, thank you, Heidi and John and everyone for putting this together, and everyone for participating. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and yeah, you can find me on Facebook if you guys have if you want to just like send me a message if you've run into any questions. I'm happy to chat and chat about stuff. Yeah, and yeah, Ananda, actually, let me send you the Moog audio link to Top Rails. Here we go. Start with that. So they come in silver or black, so you can yeah. And they come in 84 HP or 104, which is a little bit longer.
This is great. Thanks, Heidi.
Cool, thank you. So
amazing. Yeah, great session. And thanks everyone for the questions. Really great discussion.
Yeah, thank you guys again.
Thank you,
So
Sophie.
I'll link everybody once the recording is up. I just need to like access it, because the last time I did it on Zoom, I couldn't find it after. So now it's lost forever.
Cool. Thank you, Sophie, again, and John for for putting this Sound of Data thing together. And I hope we can all meet in person in the near future and do more stuff. So
yeah, me too. Thanks again, guys.
Okay.
Bye.
Awesome. Okay, thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.